Hey guys, I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question, and then things are going to get less and less hypothetical pretty quickly. What if there was a simple, brutally effective technology that we could use today to mitigate the impact of climate change? What if it was ugly? What if it created a shadow in the sky hanging over Greenland, hanging over northern Canada? But it reflected away the sun's light, allowed us to control how much solar radiation the planet was receiving as a whole, but specifically allowed us to mitigate the effects of the warming of the Arctic Ocean, allowed us to slow down or stop entirely the breakup of the Arctic ice pack. It allowed us to stop the breakup of the mass of ice in the far north that so crucially involves the release of methane into the atmosphere from permafrost in Siberia, to a lesser extent in Alaska and in northern Canada. What if that technology already existed? Wouldn't we all be talking about it? Maybe, maybe not. One of the reasons why I think that technology is not being discussed right now is that we have a broad-based commitment, completely understandable, towards encouraging a kind of virtue amongst national governments and even industries, even city governments around the world, where we try to tell people, make the small changes, do your part. For example, we encourage many governments try to get rid of coal power plants, which is very, very difficult for governments to do. Even a wealthy country like Australia. Australia has some of the most polluting, the most terrible coal power plants in the world. But Australia, with all its millions, with its bottomless annual budget for the government, finds it very, very difficult to stop using coal, or even to reduce its use of coal. Currently, international organizations, some national governments and diplomatic corps are trying to talk to very poor governments about reducing their use of coal for the greater good, for the cause of climate change, etc., etc. It's difficult to have those conversations if you have this type of brutally effective technology sitting on the table as an option, and if the cost for employing that technology is going to fall entirely on wealthy nations such as the United States, Canada, Russia, possibly England. Okay, what's the technology I'm talking about? It's been around since the 1950s, people. Near-Earth orbit satellites. You can very easily have an array of near-Earth orbit satellites that are used as a so-called geoengineering space mirror. Fancy term, but the reality is not fancy. To deflect away or control as much of the sun's radiation as you like. Does that solve the problem? No, not entirely. It mitigates the problem. It would crucially help us control and sustain the presence of ice in the Arctic Ocean, the existence of the North Pole. It would let us maintain ice on crucial coastlines to prevent the breakup of permafrost. And with the breakup of permafrost, it lets us stop releasing enormous amounts of methane into the atmosphere. I'm not talking about industrial production of methane here. This is methane that already exists in the soil, in permafrost, soil, whatever you want to say. It's locked currently under ice and frozen sludge in the world's permafrost. And when the warming of the water and the breakup of that ice releases that methane into the atmosphere, it has a feedback loop effect, accelerating global warming. It's tremendously dangerous. But as solutions go, near-Earth orbit satellites are not elegant. It's not science fiction. And I think it's very interesting that when this problem has been discussed in newspapers and mainstream sources, they've always focused on the most outlandish, the most grandiose, the most science fiction-like versions of this strategy, such as not having the array in near-Earth orbit, but instead having it out at Lagrange point L1. You don't need to know what it is, but having a set of mirrors very, very far from the Earth, further away than the Moon. The Moon is very far from the Earth. You may think it's close, but compared to near-Earth orbit, compared to the satellites that give you your TV signal every day, that's very, very far away, and it's much more expensive. They tend to think about enormous networks that would, in a diaphanous way, filter the light coming to the Earth so that we wouldn't even notice this was happening. Very elegant, very science fiction. What I'm talking about is ugly, it's practical, we can do it now. It's much, much simpler than the type of technology that already exists for the weaponization of near Earth orbit, the use of missiles, etc., by orbital platforms. We already do tremendously complex and sophisticated things in space. Not going to bother giving you examples. Compared to sending an unmanned exploration vehicle to Mars, this is dirt simple. You're talking about unfolding a metal tine that is itself much simpler than even having, the solar wings, as we call them, generating electricity for other satellites. And the best thing about near-Earth orbit is that if something goes wrong, you can fix it. It's close, it's quick. If you need to take any of the satellites down, if you need to repair them, if you need to replace them, you can do it, you can get it done. But the result would not be invisible. It would mean that a boat going past the coast of Greenland, going through the Arctic Ocean, we do actually have a lot of trade now. Now that there's less and less ice, believe it or not, Arctic Ocean trade has been increasing because those waters are more and more navigable now than they ever have been in history. Or some of our remote Arctic peoples in northern Canada. Certainly Siberia. Siberia is relatively densely populated compared to northern Canada. There would be people who every day would see this strange shadow interfering with the sun's rays. They would be able to observe this technology, as ugly and brutal as it is. And that technology would hang in the sky as a constant reminder of our shame and of our guilt, that we had to do this, that we had to put pieces of metal in orbit to reflect away the sun's radiation, because we could not take responsibility. We could not make better use of the resources that we had. We could not make decisions such as becoming vegan, stopping eating meat, stopping wasting enormous amounts of resources on torturing animals to death for food that is unhealthy, unnecessary, etc. It would be a constant reminder of the immaturity and irresponsibility of humanity itself. And that may be one of the reasons why this option is so rarely discussed. But if you Google a little bit, you will find there have been both academic conferences and government meetings discussing this. It is an option that I think all of the world's major governments are aware of, that there have been conferences on, etc., and that within the next 30 years we're going to have to discuss and decisively deploy. And it cuts counter to our sense of global responsibility, because it won't be all the world's governments doing it. It may just be the United States and Canada, or just the US and Canada and England. I don't know. I mean, in terms of political science, cooperation with Russia is not at an all-time high lately, but obviously Russia and Siberia are of really special concern. We're talking about controlling maintaining ice mass and avoiding Arctic methane from escaping, etc. But it would be a small number of wealthy countries taking on a budget of many billions of dollars, because everything in orbit costs money, and this doesn't generate any money, unlike bringing your TV signals every day. Scientific knowledge is one thing. The social conditions for the production and dissemination of scientific knowledge are another. It is not with any sense of a conspiracy theory that I just want to close this video by emphasizing. The people who are involved with climate science are human, all too human. I met some of them. One in particular I knew at some depth and some length. I knew her, I met her mom, I met her sister. I'm not even going to mention what country this came in. I want this to remain anonymous. But I did know personally one scientist. She was a real scientist, but she was engaged full-time in the politics of climate change. She was one of the people in the small elite who attend the United Nations meetings that you read about in the newspaper and other global conferences where the idea of a carbon tax gets debated, where different government resolutions to have targets for reducing carbon emissions get debated, and also where plans to try to save specific endangered species get debated, those things. And through her, I really had a sense of the social conditions of these scientists who live this life. I met some of her colleagues, but really it was from her talking about her work life and talking about her colleagues and talking about their social lives. And these people all ate meat. I didn't hear about even one of them who was vegetarian, even though they know that meat, it's the most important thing you can do to show you care about the world's environment is to eliminate meat, dairy, and eggs from your diet, to become vegan. None of them were vegan. They're all taking flights, 10 flights a year, partly because they're attending these political events. I understand it's part of their job, but they all knew that the specific type of upper atmosphere air pollution from airplanes is of such importance compared to other forms of pollution for climate change, and they're doing it anyway. They're living with these contradictions, wearing leather, eating meat, taking flights, driving cars, owning multiple cars, owning SUVs. And in terms of their lives, they're human, all too human. It seemed to me all of them were drinking alcohol. It seemed to me most of them, if not all of them, were using marijuana, if not other drugs like ecstasy in their spare time. Scientists are not angels. They're human beings. And it seemed to me like so much of the talk was about who was cheating on their wife with whom, who were they going to sleep with next after they were done cheating on their wife or their husband with this person or that person, and, who was falling in love with and getting married to, the soap opera element of who these scientists were and what have you. And, I don't hold any of that against them. I really don't. I've worked in many diverse fields of human endeavor. I've met Buddhist monks and, professors of philosophy and, political activists at different levels. They're all human beings, and they all have these problems, the human heart. But it is peculiar that this issue of such tremendous importance has relied on people who are not politicians and who don't understand politics very well, taking a set of scientific anecdotes and trying to package them into a political program. And you could see, even my discussions with her, with just that one scientist, okay, here's an animal that's going to go extinct because of climate change. Is it cute enough that we can take this and make this into a news story or make this into a political cause? The attempt to try to package a factoid into something. Okay, the acidification of the world's oceans. Do you think we can get that on the front cover of National Geographic magazine? That is linked. The change in the acidity of the oceans is linked to the amount of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere. It's a fascinating issue. Do you think we can take that, get it on the cover of a major magazine, and then once it's on the cover of the major magazine, what can we do with this in terms of international politicking, in terms of negotiating agreements, and so on? We're all at a tremendous disadvantage, in part because those people, those scientists, they're not army generals, they're not elected politicians, they're not career bureaucrats even. In some ways, I think they're also not media personalities or masters of manipulating the press or what have you. In some ways, they're the worst prepared people to shoulder the burden of the task they have. And that task is of trying to break through public indifference and to motivate people to make a million changes, both big and small, from becoming vegan on a personal level to committing the budget to making a transition away from coal power, and yes, sadly, maybe tragically, to committing to put metal objects in space to reflect away some of the sun's radiation, because we sacrificed every other opportunity to solve this problem before it got to that dire point where that kind of intervention was really necessary.